Hello, fellow students. This video is about consciousness, specifically about how attention and emotions determine the contents of consciousness. We will start with a few definitions. First of all, researchers do not agree in a particular definition. What consciousness is and how exactly consciousness arises from physical matter, the brain, is a problem that remains to be solved. Breedlove defines consciousness as our perception of what is going in our minds, perception of what's going on around us in the real world or dream world, sense of time passing, sense of being aware, recollection of past events, imaginings about the future. Kolb and Wishaw define consciousness as a state of being awake, the level of responsiveness of the mind to impressions made by the senses. Gazzaniga says that consciousness is the word we use to describe the subjective feeling of a number of instincts and/or memories playing out in time in an organism. Ledoux proposes that consciousness is what resides in working memory. States of consciousness occur when the system responsible for awareness becomes privy to the activity occurring in unconscious processing systems. Damasio's definition is my favorite. A state of mind that occurs when we are awake and in which there is private and personal knowledge of our own existence, situated relative to whatever its surround may be at a given moment. Conscious states of mind handle knowledge based on different sensory material. Conscious states of mind are felt. Sensory material corresponds to objects and events of the world around us, but also to what happens within ourselves. What all these definitions have in common is that consciousness arises from the integration of information acquired through the senses, what we perceive now or we perceived in the past and we recall from memory. Consciousness generates, orients, organizes, and transforms all this information into maps of the body and the outside world in terms of our needs. It does this to improve life management and consequently the chances of survival. The function of consciousness is thus quite simple: to predict a possible future and create plans of action so that we can either change this future or adapt to it. According to the thesis of modularity, the brain is composed of highly interconnected yet relatively autonomous specialized networks called modules. Each module serves a specific function. For instance, modules in the visual cortex interpret colors and shape. Modules in the temporal lobe that process auditive stimuli interpret sounds, etc. Consciousness results from the meaningful integration of the processes performed by semi-independent modules. I like to compare brain modularity to cities within a map. Imagine that neurons are buildings forming neighborhoods and then cities, and that streets and freeways are tracts, bundles of axons connecting it all together. Some parts of our brain are super connected, some are not as connected, yet they all share information with each other through tracts. The added work of separate components creates the illusion of an undivided entity that we call consciousness. Because consciousness' function is to improve life and our chances of survival, and because an important part of minimizing risks is being able to make fast decisions, consciousness can only process a maximum amount of information at any given time. Consciousness capacity is equal to that of working memory, 4 to 7 items at a time. Why such a small capacity? Because we evolved in a dangerous world, one where we had to make the best possible decision in the shortest amount of time. To survive, we needed not only a process to integrate and transform information into plans of action, but also a mechanism to help us choose what information will enter consciousness. That mechanism is attention. We'll cover attention in more detail later, but for now a small definition will help. Attention refers to the process of narrowing awareness selectively to a part of the sensory environment or to a class of stimuli, so that we disregard irrelevant stimuli. Attention affects how we construct reality. Attention selectivity is necessary because by letting into consciousness only relevant information, attention mechanisms prevent overloading and ease the process of making decisions. In Learning How to Learn, Oatley and Sejnowski use the metaphor of an attentional octopus with only 4 arms, the capacity limits of working memory. The attentional octopus pulls brain links out of long-term storage, represented by a locker. Those brain links represent memories, recreated in consciousness. The idea here is that despite the capacity limits of consciousness, if we possess long and complex long-term memories, brain links, we can always pull them into consciousness to solve problems. Nevertheless, consciousness will only contain a limited set of information at any given time. It is like using a computer to access the internet. You can display on your screen all kinds of information, but at any given time, you only have access to the information currently displayed on your screen. If you visit a new site, what your screen displays will change. A good example of the limited capacity of consciousness is narrative transportation, the illusion of being transported within a story world. During narrative transportation, the physical world seems to disappear. Our attention is so focused on the events of a story that we stop paying attention to whatever happens around us, so we no longer perceive our surroundings consciously. Our brains continue receiving information from the senses. What occurs during narrative transportation is that attentional mechanisms obeying to the emotional relevance of a stimulus dictate which sensory information to attend and which information to ignore. The illusion of detachment from the physical world is a consequence of the phenomenon of inattentional blindness, a goal-driven yet unconscious mechanism that prevents distractors from entering consciousness so that we can devote our full attention to a specific task. The classic example of inattentional blindness is Simons and Chabris's invisible gorilla experiment, which I hope you watched before this video. When asked to count the number of passes that the team wearing white makes, most people that watch the video miss the gorilla. It is not that we cannot perceive it. We can, but we unconsciously choose to ignore it. We do so because we take the gorilla for one of the players wearing black, and because focusing on what the members of the black team do is not relevant to our current goal. The loss of awareness comes then from being engaged, a sustained focus of attention on the task at hand in the expectation of a payout. In this case, the payout would be the satisfaction of successfully counting the number of passes that the white team makes. It is a rather small payout, yet sufficient to grab our attention and make the task reign in consciousness. Notwithstanding its capacity limits, consciousness is quite flexible in regards to the kind of information it lets in. Gazzaniga compares the process through which relatively independent mental modules produce consciousness to bubbles of boiling water popping continuously, and as they do, gaining control of the mind. The heat that makes these bubbles surge are attention mechanisms modulated by arousal, the autonomic and hormonal responses caused by an emotional episode. Arousal is a mechanism through which emotions wake up the brain to make it more receptive, lock attention, enhance our ability to store content in memory, and ready the body for action. Emotions, therefore, are an idea's ticket into consciousness. Emotions are solutions to problems. Think of them as your operative system. According to Ledoux, emotions are the expression of neural circuits involved in defense, maintenance of energy and nutritional supplies, fluid balance, thermoregulation, and reproduction. Emotions act as an interior reward and punishment system that informs an animal how it is faring in the quest for survival. For instance, anger signals that a goal has failed, but that it can be reinstated if we put up a fight. Sadness indicates that a goal is irrevocably lost. Joy signals that our goal has just been attained or that it's nearly accomplished. And contentment signals that we have reached satiation and can take a rest. According to appraisal theories of emotion, an emotional response follows the unconscious appraisal of a stimulus as a potential threat, a reward, or as something not relevant to our survival. The process through which emotions drive thoughts into consciousness is not linear. It is a rather complex one, dependent on the assessment of the relative pleasantness of a stimulus, but also on experience, exposure to goal-relevant or inherently emotional stimuli and distractors, as well as on the quality of the interconnectivity of the cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex with the limbic region. The battle for consciousness is therefore a battle between top-down and bottom-up attention processes inhibiting each other through their emotional weight. Which goal will prevail depends on the integration of sensory information with concepts stored in memory and our ability to extract new meaning from them, but also on how these memories link to an emotion. The stimulus with the higher emotional weight is the one that wins control of consciousness. Ledoux proposes that the amygdala is the area responsible for assigning emotional significance to stimuli through two different neural pathways. In the low road, the amygdala receives rough and unfiltered sensory information through its connections to the thalamus before the same information can reach the cortex where it can be appropriately interpreted. The low road accounts for less accurate yet faster responses, which come useful in situations where the time is crucial, as would be the sudden appearance of a predator. In the high road, the amygdala receives information already processed by the cortex, not so much so that responses could be made, Ledoux argues, but so that inappropriate responses could be inhibited. Ledoux's diagram is oversimplified and gives too much decision power to the amygdala. Recent research proposes that rather than assigning affective valence to a stimulus, that the amygdala responds to the intensity of affect, and the process of assigning emotional valence to a stimulus involves more brain regions, namely the anterior cingulate cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and the thalamus. For instance, these diagrams here are for the functional connectivity of the amygdala under circumstances of conscious and non-conscious fear, per an article by Williams and colleagues, who use fMRI to identify the regions of interest. Green arrows represent positive functional connectivity, and red arrows represent negative connectivity. However the balance of a stimulus is first assessed, the intensity of an emotional response or arousal is what determines whether the significance of a stimulus will capture attention, enter consciousness, and remain in consciousness for long. Recent research links the secretion of the neurotransmitter orexin, also called hypocretin, by the lateral hypothalamus to arousal promoting exploratory behavior, in addition to arousal that promotes wakefulness following circadian rhythms. This diagram shows the neuronal connections of the hypothalamic area with the ventral tegmental area, which produces dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with learning, attention, and motivation. The locus coeruleus, which produces norepinephrine, another promoter of attention and facilitator of learning. The tuberomammillary nucleus, which produces histamine, promoter of wakefulness. The raphe nuclei in the brainstem, which produce serotonin, which modulates aversion to risk, and thus it is associated with reduced levels of aggression. And the laterodorsal and pedunculopontine tegmental nuclei in the brainstem, which produce acetylcholine, another promoter of attention. The diagram also shows the hypothalamic connections with the prefrontal, somatosensory, and association cortices. In simple words, regardless of its valence as either positive or negative, the higher the emotional significance of a stimulus, the stronger the arousal it will produce, and the higher the likelihood that perception of that stimulus will enter consciousness. It takes more than one strong emotion to engage attention, however, it takes a goal. When we recognize a stimulus as neither relevant to our current goals nor inherently threatening, other stimuli capture our attention, gaining control of consciousness. Goals are a necessary condition for engaging attention because goals set the measure against which stimuli are categorized, making them emotionally relevant. Without goals, all stimuli are equally irrelevant. In brief, for a physical stimulus to enter consciousness, it must be detected by our senses first, then perceived by the brain, that is, interpreted. In this case, these colors and shapes are perceived as flowers. What we perceive must then be appraised as either good, bad, or not relevant to our current goals. From that appraisal follows an emotional response consisting on changes in behavior, autonomic responses such as higher pulse or sweating, and the release of hormones into the bloodstream. If you missed the invisible gorilla, it was because a black figure moving in the background was not relevant to your goal. Thus, you had a very low or no emotional response to it. Up to this point, all these processes are unconscious. If the emotional response is strong enough, it will guide attention to the stimulus. It is then that we become conscious of having perceived the stimulus. The autonomic and hormonal responses provoke feelings, which are the conscious perception of the changes provoked by the emotional response. Feelings act like somatic markers, signaling the relative goodness and importance of a stimulus and thus as a guide to conscious responses. In simpler words, our conscious response to the flowers will depend on an unconscious appraisal of the flower's relevance and how the flowers make us feel. That's it for now. Thank you very much. Continue reading and see you soon. Hopefully. Bye bye.